Dead Space 2. What a game, dude. You know, originally I had this whole script typed up in a regular review fashion, but I was having a lot of trouble with it. And as I kept playing Dead Space 2, I kinda realized what I was writing felt a little too self-serious. I was writing a review on a game that had already been reviewed when what I really wanted to talk about was just how much I love Dead Space 2. So I took that script and I threw that in the garbage. So let's just talk about how much Dead Space kicks ass. And dude, Dead Space 2 fucking kicks ass.
Isaac, we're all gonna burn for what we did to you.
I've been consistently playing Dead Space 2 since it came out in 2011. I've probably beaten this thing a few dozen times by now, and to be honest, it still hasn't gotten old.
I don't know what you're talking about. Why are you calling me?
The people at Visceral really just took everything that worked in Dead Space and evolved it into a more satisfying and fun experience. They also took everything that didn't work and reworked it, or outright scrapped it. I'm looking at you, Turret Defense Section.
What the fuck is this piece of shit?
I feel like a lot of people call Dead Space survival horror, but it really isn't. It's action horror. It was largely inspired by Resident Evil 4, which was also action horror. Dead Space could be tense, yeah, and scary, absolutely. I mean, the Hunter is fucking terrifying, dude. But it was always mostly about having plenty of ammo to cut down any enemy you came across. Pun intended. Dead Space 2 is still action horror, but it's action horror in all caps. The horror is far more intense here, with some parts being not just scarier, but like downright disturbing. And the same goes for the action. Dead Space 2 has some fucking awesome action moments that had me, like, on the edge of my seat, dude.
You gonna do superhero landing? Wait for it!
Woo! Superhero landing! Yeah, that's really hard on your knees.
Totally impractical, they all do it.
Dead Space 2 is just more. More action, more horror, more enemies, and more tools to fuck them up with. Dead Space 2 does everything a proper sequel should, and I just kinda want to talk about everything, and the best place to start with is taking place about 3 years after Dead Space 1, Isaac is a broken shell of a man. He's been institutionalized and sedated, and he keeps seeing visions of Nicole, his girlfriend from the first game he failed to save.
What did it say to you, Isaac? Isaac, can you hear me?
Pretty much immediately, you get thrown into the deep end as a new necromorph outbreak starts on the Sprawl, the space station Isaac finds himself on.
Holy shit!
And over the course of the game, Isaac will have to come to terms with his own grief, while also trying to stop the marker and just survive. And I mean, the most immediate thing to notice is that Isaac speaks this time around.
Why are you doing this? Why can't everyone just leave me alone, huh?
In the original, he was a silent protagonist, keeping his thoughts to himself while whatever fucked up thing happened right in front of him. Don't panic, Isaac. I'm sure Hammond's fine. Here, Isaac is fully voiced by Gunnar Wright, and he does an absolutely excellent job.
I'll stick around.
I'm full of bad ideas.
And he'd actually go on to portray Isaac in Dead Space 3 and the 2023 remake.
Do you really need me to tell you this is a bad idea?
Well, I'm all out of good ideas, so guess what's left?
Isaac is just a fascinating character, and getting his thoughts and reactions to everything was the right choice. It makes him into a proper character, rather than just a stand-in for the player. He reacts to things that happens, actually interacts with other characters, and most importantly, he deals with the trauma and the grief from the first game.
And if I let you go, I've got nothing left.
Step 4. Acceptance.
Dead Space 2 is a surprisingly emotional game, with Isaac being forced to deal directly with what happened, and I just can't imagine it being as impactful if Isaac was just silent the whole time. But while Isaac is certainly the star of the game, the other characters are also pretty excellent.
Yeah, you got that right.
Ellie is another survivor he meets, and she's just as capable as he is.
You like this? Come and get it!
Whoa, hey!
You owe me an eye, you bastard!
And I think it's a real shame that we never got a separate Waze style DLC where we got to see the game through her eyes. Shit, I mean, eye.
Yeah, you got that right.
Nolan Strauss is another interesting character, and a lot like Ellie, I think it's a shame that we didn't get to see more of him while he grappled with his hallucinations.
Relax!
Isaac, we have to get out of here.
Right. Let's go.
But as it is with the plot and the characters, the story of Dead Space 2 is really fucking good. We get to see Isaac actually grapple with PTSD, grief, and loss, and we get to learn more about the marker, unitology, and the broader universe of Dead Space.
The marker spoke to Altman and revealed a plan that would unify mankind and lead them to a bright new future.
Holy shit!
Isaac, we have to get out of here.
Right. Let's go.
And it's all presented in a way where the camera almost never breaks away from the action. It'll pull in close and pull back out, but with a few exceptions, it never actually cuts away. And like, not only does it make for a smooth experience, but it also makes for moments that might typically be cutscenes into actual gameplay. Like these scenes where Isaac has to fly with his suit, or here where he's upside down fighting necromorphs, or here where he has to actually finally confront Tideman, a sort of side villain. It just makes for a really immersive experience. Like, I really can't praise the characters, story, or how they're presented enough. But I mean, really the main reason I come back to Dead Space 2 isn't the narrative or the characters. I mean, The Last of Us, this ain't.
Take it easy, buddy. Just take it easy.
And like, yeah, I like a good story, but for me, gameplay and combat is where it's at. And dude, the combat in Dead Space is still top fucking notch. Like I said, I've been playing this since it came out, and it really is just because the combat is so damn fun. Visceral took that excellent dismemberment system and just made it way more satisfying. Like, yeah, you're still cutting these abominations apart with precise shots, but now they're just way more juicy, I guess? Like, blood goes everywhere as you slice them apart, and you can hear the flesh just getting absolutely ripped apart. I mean, the combat in Dead Space already felt excellent, but now it looks and sounds absolutely superb. And I mean, that's just the actual shooting. And slicing, and cutting, and blasting, you get the point. But they also built on top of the Kinesis system from the first game, making it far more useful in combat. In the first game, Kinesis was mainly used for completing environmental puzzles or just progressing through various areas. Here, you'll be using it to impale enemies against walls with random spikes and even rip the limbs right off of enemies and throw them back. I mean, fucking hell, dude.
That's gotta hurt! It's gotta hurt!
And like, not only is this just a super fun mechanic, but it actually makes sense in context of the world and situation where desperation would breed that sort of violence. Like, yeah, when you're fighting for your life, you'd be using every tool at your disposal, including the spiky bits of the things you just had to put down. It's worth mentioning too that Stasis is back, and much like Kinesis, it's a far more useful tool in your kit this time. You could slow enemies in the first game, but I don't think you ever had to do that, like maybe with the brutes and the twitchers, but that was about it. In Dead Space 2, Stasis isn't just a lot more useful thanks to enemies being far faster and aggressive, but like, on the harder difficulties, it's downright necessary. Once you get into Survivalist and above, enemies will absolutely fuck your shit up. Not only are they just fast, but they don't do that thing where enemies, patiently take their turns to smack you. If you let 2 or 3 gang up on you, might as well call you Piper Perry the way that you're about to be fucked. And I mean, Dead Space 2 overall is just a far more difficult game than the first ever was. I played on Survivalist for my first playthrough for this video, and I was regularly getting my ass handed to me, one cheek at a time. And what I really love about the difficulty in Dead Space 2 is that it really feels like it's a more skill-based experience. Like, it's not just artificial difficulty, you know what I mean? Like, I never died and felt like it was bullshit. It was always because I missed a shot with Kinesis, or failed to slow an enemy with the Stasis, or just let enemies get a bit too close. And those harder difficulties really push you to use every single tool you have, and use them well. Ammo and health are a lot scarcer, so you really have to use Kinesis and Stasis.
Yeah, you got that right.
Overall, it's a combat system that pushes you but never feels unfair. And thanks to the actual feedback, it just never gets old. I mean, it's a combat system so good that the 2023 remake of the first game plays basically the exact same as Dead Space 2.
They're the same picture.
But a combat sandbox this good would be wasted if you didn't have fun enemies to use it on. And brother, the enemies in Dead Space 2 are excellent. Dead Space 2 brings back basically the whole roster of enemies from the first game. Slashers, lurkers, leapers, oh my. But there are actually a bunch of new enemies as well, like a surprising amount. And they're all interesting to fight and designed in a way to actually change how you approach combat. Like they've added these guys called stalkers, and these things hide behind walls or crates or whatever and try to flank and rush you. They've also extrapolated on the idea of infected children with these exploding infants and packs of kids rushing you like they just heard you got games on your phone. And like, jokes aside, this is actually pretty horrific. I mean, this scene in the daycare is downright disturbing. I mean, shit. And now you're having to cut down not just regular necromorph men, but the women and the children too. And both of these enemy types try to rush you, forcing you to end them before they can either overwhelm you or blow you up. There's also a new type of brute enemy you'll come across called the tripod that's just a mass of bodies. Gross.
Jesus, that thing was angry.
As well as this stationary enemy that acts sort of like a wall guardian, throwing these projectiles at you. There's an enemy that pukes acid at you, forcing you to sort of dodge and weave through his attacks, and this thing called Assist that launches these, what the hell is that thing anyway?
Oh my god, it looks like a huge...
Pecker!
Oh, where?
Well, anyways, I think all of these add substantially to the combat sandbox. Some force you to just throw shots down range like the pack, and others, like the stalkers, require aiming that's not just precise, but fast. Like I said earlier, Dead Space 2 is actually far more skill-based than the first, and enemy variety contributes a lot to that. And just like enemies, Dead Space 2 has some new additions when it comes to the weaponry. Much like the enemies, when it comes to weapons, Dead Space 2 brings back all the greatest hits. There's the trusty plasma cutter, the line gun, the pulse rifle. I mean, they're all here. And for the most part, they remain the same, although they did replace that stupid alternate fire mode for the pulse rifle with a proper grenade launcher. And all of the weapons still feel absolutely excellent, especially with some beefed up sound design. But there are a few new additions, and sadly, I think they're a bit of a letdown, if only because they just sort of feel redundant. I mean, the Seeker rifle is another proper firearm, like the pulse rifle, and I mean, it's meant for precise shots, but I feel like the plasma cutter already has that locked down. And yeah, you can zoom in, but enemies don't really bother fighting at a range, so it's kinda like, what even is the point? There's also the javelin gun, and this thing fires spikes that can impale enemies as well as electrocute nearby enemies. And like, yeah, that's pretty cool. But at the same time, you can literally rip the limbs off of the dead to impale other enemies or use those spikes that are laying around. And so again, it just feels kind of redundant when I can just use kinesis and get the same results. Finally, they've added a detonator, which can lay these mines that can be triggered and exploded by enemies. But when enemies are this fast, I never really got a chance to lay down mines in a defensive position, and it just felt easier to cut the legs off of the fast-moving necromorphs rather than set a trap that could never be ran into, or worse, ran into by me as I panicked. I mean, I've played this game for years, and I always go back to the classic weapons, and not just because they're familiar, but because I think they're just objectively better than any of the newly added ones. but at least they do add variety. And while they might feel a bit redundant, at least to me, at least they can be used effectively by players that want to use them. And I mean, in the end, that's really the only complaint I have with this game. And even then, it's not much of a complaint, more like a nitpick. But speaking of weapons, I do want to talk about the progression real quick. Progression in Dead Space 2 works a lot like it did in the first game. You'll find these nodes scattered around the environment and use them at these workbenches in order to upgrade your suit and weapons. Though it's worth mentioning that they can also be used to open up these supply rooms. At the benches, you can upgrade damage, ammo capacity, reload speed, and so on. And some weapons even have special upgrades, like the plasma cutter, that when unlocked does damage over time to enemies. Unfortunately, they did keep those blank connector nodes from the first game that just make unlocking upgrades take longer, and it's equally annoying here.
That's simply not possible.
Why isn't it possible?
It's just not.
Why not, you stupid bastard?
What I will say is that the new suit upgrade system is way better. You still find those suit schematics that increase armor and inventory size, but now they also have unique abilities like more damage with certain weapons or more healing from med packs. So in that way, it almost feels like you can start to get a build going, like a light RPG. And on top of that, the suits in Dead Space 2 look way cooler than the ones in Dead Space 1. They also have these super cool suit up animations, and if I'm being honest, they kinda never fail to hype me up.
Yes! That's awesome!
So like, overall, the upgrade system is pretty satisfying, especially when it comes to finding new suits, which, by the way, you find even more in New Game Plus. It's a system that, like the combat, absolutely holds up. And I mean, honestly, Dead Space 2 holds up in about every way, including how it looks and feels. Dead Space 2 was an absolute looker when it came out. Or at least, I remember it looking better than a lot of other games at the time. I was also playing it on an Xbox 360 on like a 20-inch RCA that had a VCR built into it, so who's to say? But what I'll say now is that Dead Space 2 looks and plays great on modern hardware. Like, I played this on my PC with no crashing or stuttering or anything. And beyond it just running perfect, the game actually looks good still, I feel. Enemies are detailed and lighting looks really great, and the sprawl in general just looks really fucking cool. I also want to take a second to say that I love how games look during this era. It might be nostalgia talking, but I just have a real appreciation for how games like Dead Space 2, Max Payne 3, Mass Effect 3, or really any game from the late 2000s to the mid 2010s look. It's a big reason I like going back and playing these games. But that said, I still think that this is just a great looking game. And backed up by some great sound design, great acting, and that camera that almost never cuts, it just makes for a really immersive experience. And for it to actually work smoothly on modern hardware is the cherry on top. But alright man, how about we wrap this whole thing up, huh? Dead Space 2 is one of the best action horror games ever made. Hell, it might be one of the best games ever made, full stop. The characters are interesting, the lore is really cool, and the actual core gameplay is some of the most fun you can have in a third-person shooter. And that's not even to mention just how replayable it is, where in New Game Plus, you get more suits, weapons, and you can play through those harder difficulties. It's just awesome. And like, even when I wasn't playing Dead Space 2, all I wanted to do was get back on the PC and play more Dead Space 2. Slicing up necromorphs just doesn't get old. And I don't know if we'll ever get a full-on Dead Space 2 remake like we did with the first. I'm holding on to hope that we will one day, cause it'd be a real shame if we didn't. But like, even if we don't, Dead Space 2 holds up remarkably well, not just in gameplay, but with everything. And I think it even runs at 60 FPS on those newer Xboxes. If you've never played it, what the hell are you waiting for, dude? And if you have played it, consider this a reminder to go replay it. And now, if you'll excuse me, these corpses, they ain't gonna stomp themselves.
Stop! He's already dead!